In 1757, a man with mental instability named Robert François Damiens made an attempt on the life of King Louis XV with a knife. While Louis sustained an injury, the substantial winter furs he was wearing acted as a shield, preventing a fatal blow. The brutal retribution exacted upon the would-be assassin was so extreme and unsettling that numerous historians even now concur that it was excessive. The actual historical figure of Louis XVII makes the majority of so-called mad kings appear almost saintly by comparison. This erratic monarch has gained notoriety due to his scandalous romantic involvements and for steering France towards the precipice of collapse. Some individuals are born into privilege, but even they pale in comparison to Louis XVII. His birth likely occurred in the most opulent setting in history, the Palace of Versailles, during the era of the Sun King Louis XIV. However, beneath the veneer of lavishness, something corrupt was developing within France, with young Louis at its core. Similar to many monarchs, Louis XV was not initially destined for the throne. With his uncle, father, and elder brother preceding him in the line of succession, Louis appeared to be headed for a luxurious existence as the Duke of Anjou. Yet royals have a habit of dying unexpectedly, and shortly after Louis's birth, his relatives began to perish at an alarming rate. The first to die was Louis's uncle, the Grand Dauphin, who succumbed to smallpox barely a year after Louis was born. However, just when it seemed matters couldn't worsen, they did. The measles epidemic was not yet finished with his family. Shortly after the demise of Louis's parents, royal physicians discovered that both Louis and his older brother had also contracted the same illness that had claimed their parents, two otherwise healthy adults. Consequently, few within the court believed either child had any prospect of survival. In the end, they were only partially mistaken. Doctors employed every available method to save the two young brothers. Unfortunately, medical practices at that time were quite rudimentary. They essentially just drained blood from the two boys. Incredibly, it turns out that blood is somewhat essential. Mere days after the diagnosis, Louis's 5-year-old brother succumbed to a combination of the disease and the treatment. It seems certain that young Louis was destined for the same fate as the rest of his family. However, Louis possessed something they lacked, a guardian angel. This guardian angel was Madame de Ventadour, his governess. Ventadour, seemingly the only voice of reason in all of France, recognized that it was probably ill-advised to cut open this 2-year-old and deplete his blood. She kept all surgeons away from the boy, and remarkably, Louis actually recovered. It appeared to be a miracle. Yet in reality, Ventadour had merely ensured that France was in for decades of turmoil. In 1715, when Louis was 5 years old, his grandfather, the Sun King, finally passed away at the age of 72. For the first time in as many years, France was about to have a new monarch. Under Louis XIV, France had risen to become one of the most dominant nations globally. How much damage could his grandson, the new Louis XV, inflict? Regrettably, it turned out to be quite substantial. Having a child as the King of France gave rise to some peculiar diplomatic situations. Consider the occasion when the imposing Russian Tsar Peter the Great visited France. Upon seeing the French king, Peter joyfully lifted Louis and gave him a hearty kiss. Not exactly the customary greeting between kings of two powerful nations, but then again, nothing was conventional about the strange early years of Louis XV's reign. Even though the King of France was just a young child, the country took measures to ensure he couldn't create utter chaos. Louis would not wield significant real power until he reached adulthood. Until then, his regent and advisors governed the country, and they did a commendable job. Under their watchful guidance, France entered a new era of enlightenment. Then Louis reached adulthood and, well, let's just say matters deteriorated. As mentioned, France was not foolish enough to permit a child king to govern the nation. They waited until he was a wise 13-year-old before entrusting him with that responsibility. That's when Louis finally assumed his position as king. And what is a king without a queen? In what would undoubtedly have been the most sensational season of The Bachelor ever, French officials compiled a list of 99 princesses from across Europe. Ultimately, only one could receive the rose, Marie Lashinska, a Polish princess. The poor woman had no idea what she was in for. The 15-year-old Louis married the 22-year-old princess in a lavish ceremony in 1725. They promptly set about fulfilling their royal duty, and their first child arrived in 1727. Queen Maria would spend the subsequent decade in a near-constant state of pregnancy. However, it wasn't long before the young parents experienced the agonizing pain of loss. Although Louis and Maria eventually had 10 children, if history has taught us anything, it's that having a king for a father is detrimental to one's health. The couple's second son, the adorable little Duke of Anjou, passed away at just 3 years old. The couple was devastated, but this did not deter them from having 4 more children in the following 4 years. If you think that having 10 children in 10 years is excessive, you're not alone. It soon began to take its toll. Initially, the marriage of Louis and Maria seemed like a perfect match. Both were incredibly shy, and they grew exceptionally close almost immediately. For the initial years of their marriage, palace inhabitants claimed they were completely inseparable. But people evolve, and as time passed, their bond began to fray. Before long, this loving relationship would become painfully cold and distant, and Louis's gaze would begin to wander. Although Louis was a timid child, being the all-powerful King of France has a way of inflating one's ego. By the time Louis reached his 20s, he was a fully developed womanizer. With his wife understandably exhausted from a perpetual series of pregnancies, Louis discovered a new pastime: mistresses. The first was one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, the stunning Louise. Apparently, Louis de Fiorentine absorbed at least one lesson from observing his grandfather, the Sun King. Whatever I decree goes. So when Louis desired to elevate his new paramour Louise to the status of a duchess, he did so without hesitation. Give Louis credit for one thing. The man was utterly shameless and things were only going to escalate. Louise was merely the first in a long line of scandalous mistresses for Louis XIV. Before long, the entire French court was aware of the king's appetites. Louis had begun taking mistresses, but he still harbored some affection for his wife. That all shifted in 1738 after Queen Maria miscarried her 11th pregnancy. Her physicians advised her to abstain from marital relations until her body recovered. It's reasonable to assume that after a decade of pregnancies, the poor woman deserved a respite. But apparently Louis disagreed. When the king learned of this, his reaction was profoundly disturbing. Soon enough, the church intervened and attempted to persuade Louis to at least make confession, as adultery is, after all, a sin. Instead, Louis simply ceased taking communion and continued his philandering. And if the sheer number of mistresses Louis took wasn't scandalous enough, his choices in mistresses were even more problematic. It didn't take long for Louis to tire of Louise, at which point his attention drifted to her sister, her married sister. Louise brought her sister into his bed in 1740, and she was pregnant by the year's end. Sadly, she would pay the ultimate price for it. Both Louise's sister, Pauline, and her child died in childbirth. To be fair, Louis was quite distraught by this. His heart wasn't entirely made of stone, but before long he started to feel better and sought a rebound. And whom did he choose? Well, his previous 2 mistresses had been sisters, so why alter the pattern now? Not long after her sister passed away, Louis XIV's first mistress, Louise, made a terrible error. She introduced him to her other sister, Marie-Anne. Louis was nothing if not predictable, and soon he only had eyes for Marie. But this sister was the black sheep of the family. Marie-Anne had her sister to thank for her new relationship with the king. So how did she repay her? She had Louis banish her older sister from Versailles, of course. Apparently, Marie-Anne and Louise did not get along, though they didn't seem to have any issue sharing the same lover. Louis XV disregarded the church's rules and engaged in sexual relationships with whomever he pleased. But when his mortality came knocking, he abruptly did a complete about-face and pleaded for forgiveness. While he was still involved with Marie-Anne, he suddenly became gravely ill. The illness was so rapid and violent that the king was certain his end was near. He begged his chaplain for absolution, but the priest stated he would only grant it if Louis dismissed his mistress. Louis didn't hesitate. He dumped Marie-Anne like a sack of bricks, only to miraculously recover and promptly return to her bed. The king survived his close encounter with death, so he ought to have been content. But he still had to pay a steep price for it. A priest recorded Louis XV's confession. He essentially disclosed all his deepest, darkest secrets, and now they were public knowledge for all of France to ridicule. You might imagine that this humiliation would finally prompt Louis to change his scandalous ways. Nope. The lustful king was just getting started. Up to this point, all of Louis XV's mistresses had exited his life almost as quickly as they entered it. It would take a special kind of woman to truly captivate this monarch. Louis observed such a woman from a distance while returning from a hunt one day in 1745. Later, he had the opportunity to meet her formally at an extravagant costume ball. Her name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, but history remembers her by another name, Madame de Pompadour. Before long, she would hold Louis's heart in her hands, and it would elevate her to one of the most influential individuals in the world. Rumor had it that she was the most beautiful and intelligent woman in Paris. These rumors eventually reached Louis XV's ears, and when he finally met her in person, she did not disappoint. While Louis preferred to retreat to Versailles and focus on his amorous pursuits, the world outside his palace was in turmoil. All the European powers were vying for dominance, and France was at the epicenter of it all. Since the reign of the Sun King, France had held the upper hand. So when Louis took up arms against Great Britain in 1756, he assumed he would easily prevail in the conflict. But Louis was more skilled with women than he was with warfare, and he was about to drive his once dominant nation to the brink. Thus began the 7 Years' War between France and England. When the conflict commenced, France possessed the clear advantage. It was a David and Goliath scenario, but we all know how that ended. Within just a few years, France had lost control of its territories in Canada and India, suffered significant defeats on its own soil, and had to completely abandon a planned invasion of England. To call this a disaster for Louis would be an understatement, but just when matters abroad were appearing dire, even worse problems arose domestically. From the safety of Versailles, surrounded by mistresses, Louis XIV likely felt quite content. But in the rest of France, the people were starting to turn against him. Not only had he defied the church with his adulterous affairs, but his military blunders were accumulating, and France's political standing was declining. Before long, the various duchies of France completely withdrew their support from Louis. When Louis ascended to the throne, France was among the wealthiest countries in the world. But between losing the majority of his overseas territories, financing his own army, and subsidizing the armies of his allies, by the early 1760s, Louis had essentially bankrupted his kingdom. He ultimately had to raise the white flag, and the consequences would be devastating. The 7 Years' War officially concluded in 1763. The entire endeavor had been a fiasco, and it left France in a far worse state than it had been before. The end of hostilities marked the nadir of Louis's life thus far, but he was about to discover he could sink even lower. The winter of 1763 was particularly harsh. Perhaps Louis believed he was being punished for his numerous failings, but the true punishment was yet to arrive. His beloved Madame de Pompadour contracted pneumonia in the frigid temperatures, and it proved fatal. After being with Louis for 20 long years, she was abruptly taken from him at the very moment when his country needed him most. His mistress's death plunged Louis into a dark spiral. Madame de Pompadour was the most significant person in Louis's life, even more so than his wife, who was incidentally still alive. Bereft of his cherished mistress, Louis was utterly lost. He withdrew into himself and neglected matters of state in his grief. Then, just as he began to recover, another devastating personal tragedy brought him to his knees once more. Just a year after Madame de Pompadour's passing, Louis's son and heir, the Dauphin, contracted tuberculosis. Within a matter of days, the prince found himself barely clinging to life. This was a time when Louis needed to be strong for the sake of his son. But by this point, Louis was essentially a broken man. Thus, his reaction to his son's illness was completely irrational. With his son on his deathbed and his country in disarray, what did Louis XV do? He secluded himself with an eccentric astronomer and spent his days gazing at the sky and making calculations. Unsurprisingly, this didn't improve matters, and his son succumbed to his illness just before Christmas in 1765. Once again, Louis descended into a profound depression. But while his son's loss deeply affected him, Louis's neglected queen was even more devastated. Losing her son left her utterly inconsolable. To compound matters, her own father passed away soon after, and then so did her daughter-in-law, who had been one of her few friends in a cold and hostile court. This relentless barrage of loss eventually proved too much for the queen, and she fell ill and passed away quietly in 1768. And how did Louis mourn his long-suffering wife? By finding a new mistress, of course. When Madame de Pompadour passed away, it seemed no woman could ever replace her in Louis's heart. Apparently, all it took was his wife's death as well for Louis to decide it was time to remarry, metaphorically speaking. Numerous women vied for a place in the king's bed, but one of them rose above the rest. Her name was Jeanne Bécu, better known as the infamous Madame du Barry. While Louis's other mistresses were unpopular, Du Barry was a scandal of a whole new magnitude. First, there was the fact that Du Barry was a full 33 years younger than the king, but that was the least of people's objections to her. More significantly, she was the daughter of a lowly seamstress. Even worse, she was born out of wedlock. Louis XV had spent his entire life offending people, but this time he had gone too far. Everyone closest to Louis utterly despised Du Barry. In 1774, the 64-year-old king's physician began to notice red spots appearing all over his royal skin. They soon realized this illness was far more serious than it initially appeared. The boils covering Louis's body worsened relentlessly, regardless of his doctor's efforts. Finally, the grim truth became undeniable. King Louis XV was on death's doorstep. On May 9, 1774, the Duc de Croix visited the ailing king. He took one look at the once dashing king and was utterly horrified by what he witnessed. In the Duc de Croix's own words, the gruesome boils on King Louis XIV's face made it appear as if he were wearing a mask of bronze. It turns out that's not something from which one can recover. Mere hours after the Duke's visit, Louis succumbed to his illness. Louis XV had irrevocably damaged the French monarchy, and it would never recover. While King Louis XV finally kicked the bucket in 1774, he had come alarmingly close to dying almost 20 years prior in 1757. On a cold January day, Louis was stepping into his carriage when a deranged man, Robert Francois d'Amiens, suddenly breached the king's guards and stabbed his royal person. However, in a bizarre twist of fate, the frigid winter ended up saving Louis's life. D'Amiens managed to penetrate the king's defenses, but he could not penetrate his thick winter clothing. The blade became entangled in the heavy wool and failed to inflict any fatal injury. The king's guards swiftly apprehended the madman, but Louis demanded they not harm him. He had a far more disturbing end in mind. It turns out that when you aim for the king, you had better not miss. Even though the French government largely detested Louis even then, they still agreed that an attack on their king was an attack on France itself. King Louis XV's tarnished reputation earned him the moniker, the Lustful King. He flaunted countless women before the French court, and Madame de Pompadour was the most renowned among them all. But throughout the 20 years Pompadour dominated affairs at Versailles, most people were unaware that the scandalous couple was concealing a shocking secret. They had actually ceased sleeping with each other just a few years after their relationship began. People assumed Louis was simply a womanizer, but ultimately he recognized that Pompadour was more than just a pretty face. He retained her for her counsel even long after their physical relationship had ended. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to continue exploring with us.